The Grand Canyon is a place that humbles anyone who dares to step into its depths. Miles of carved stone stretch beyond the horizon, walls painted with time itself, red, gold, and gray layers stacked like history's own diary. From above, it looks eternal and unshakable. But those who enter know better. The canyon doesn't forgive mistakes. It swallows them. On a summer morning, 3 friends walked into this unforgiving world. They were young, full of energy, and convinced that with the right supplies and the right attitude, nothing could go wrong. Cameras strapped to their packs, water bottles filled, they laughed at the trailhead sign, treating it like the beginning of a grand adventure. But what started as an ordinary hike turned into something no one could explain. Because after that day, none of them were ever seen again. Their families waited. Park rangers searched. Helicopters combed the cliffs and valleys. And when the dust settled, the only thing left was silence. No campfire ashes, no torn clothing, no footprints leading out of the canyon. Just absence and questions no one could answer. Weeks passed, then months, eventually years. Most assumed they had died in the wilderness, their bodies hidden somewhere deep in the canyon's maze of stone. Others whispered theories, that they had stumbled on something they weren't supposed to see, that one of them had betrayed the others, or that the canyon itself, in some strange, inexplicable way, had taken them. But the truth was stranger than anyone imagined. 8 years later, the silence was broken. Out of nowhere, one of the missing friends returned, alive, changed, and carrying a story that would leave investigators, families, and even hardened skeptics stunned. Where had he been? What had happened to the others? And why had he waited so long to come back? In today's documentary, we'll step inside one of the most unsettling mysteries the Grand Canyon has ever held. A story of friendship, disappearance, survival, and secrets that only the canyon walls may truly understand. But be warned, the answers don't come quickly. Because like the canyon itself, this story hides its truth in shadows, revealing it piece by piece. And even when you hear the survivor's words, you may be left wondering whether you've heard the truth, or just one man's desperate attempt to explain the unexplainable. This is the story of 3 friends who vanished into the Grand Canyon, and the one who returned 8 years later with a revelation no one could forget. Stay with me until the very end, because what you're about to hear is more than just a tale of loss. It's a reminder that even in the most familiar places, there are still corners of the world that refuse to give up their mysteries. Every mystery begins with people, and to understand this story, you need to know the 3 young men who stepped into the canyon that morning. They weren't strangers. They weren't reckless thrill seekers chasing danger for its own sake. They were friends, real friends, bound by years of laughter, struggles, and promises made when life still felt like it would last forever. The first was Ethan, 25 years old, the kind of man whose energy filled a room the moment he walked in. Ethan had always been the dreamer of the group. He was the one with the camera slung around his neck, always trying to capture life before it slipped by. His Instagram was filled with sunrise photos, campfire shots, and captions about chasing freedom. He believed the world was too big to stay in one place, and the Grand Canyon, with its endless horizons, called to him like a challenge he couldn't ignore. The second was Mark, a year older. Where Ethan was restless, Mark was steady. He worked as a mechanic in a small garage, his hands always smeared with grease, his head bent under the hood of an engine. He wasn't the loudest in the group, but he was the one you counted on. When Ethan suggested the canyon trip, Mark didn't hesitate. Not because he wanted adventure, but because he had promised himself he would always be there when his friends needed him. And then there was Caleb, the youngest at 23, quiet, thoughtful, and a little guarded. Caleb grew up sketching landscapes in the back of his notebooks, always watching the world rather than rushing into it. He studied geology at community college, fascinated by the way stone carried memories older than humanity itself. To him, the canyon wasn't just a place to explore. It was a story written in the earth, and he wanted to read every line of it. 3 young men, different personalities, but together they balanced one another perfectly. Ethan's boldness, Mark's reliability, Caleb's quiet curiosity. For years, they had talked about making this trip. Late-night conversations turned into promises, promises into plans. One day, Ethan said more than once, "We'll hike the canyon. We'll go where the tourists don't. We'll see the real thing." And now, finally, that day had come. Their families supported the idea, though not without concern. Everyone knew the canyon wasn't a place you entered lightly. The desert heat could kill as quickly as a snowstorm. The trails were deceptive, distances longer than they appeared. Rangers often warned visitors, "The canyon is easy to walk into, but harder to escape." Still, the 3 friends prepared carefully. They packed food, water, sleeping bags, and maps. Ethan brought his camera gear. Caleb brought notebooks for sketches and field notes. Mark, ever practical, carried tools and a first aid kit. Together, they looked ready for anything. But readiness doesn't always matter. As the morning sun spilled across the canyon walls, they set out, laughing, teasing one another, full of the confidence only youth can provide. To them, it was just another trip, one more adventure in a string of adventures they believed would stretch across a lifetime. What none of them knew was that this would be their last journey together, because in the weeks that followed, the canyon would keep its silence, and their names would be added to a growing list of those who entered its shadows and never returned. And yet, even as the story unfolds, it's important to remember who they were. Not just missing hikers on a ranger's report, not just faces on a poster, but sons, brothers, friends. Ethan, chasing the horizon. Mark, the one who always kept his word. Caleb, searching for the secrets hidden in stone. 3 young men, bound by friendship and by a fate that neither they nor anyone else could have predicted. The Grand Canyon is more than a landmark. It's a world of its own, vast, ancient, and indifferent to those who dare to cross it. Stretching 277 miles long, up to 18 miles wide, and more than a mile deep, the canyon is so massive that it can't be fully understood from a single viewpoint. Standing at the rim, tourists see a breathtaking panorama of stone painted in colors that shift with the sun. Crimson cliffs at dawn, golden walls by midday, violet shadows at dusk. It feels timeless, eternal, a masterpiece carved by the Colorado River over millions of years. But beauty here hides danger. For every stunning overlook, there are unseen hazards, cliffs that crumble beneath your feet, sudden storms that flood the narrow slot canyons, and temperatures that can swing from freezing nights to scorching afternoons. The canyon is a place of extremes. One misstep can mean the difference between life and death. Rangers often say, hiking down is optional. Hiking back up is mandatory. And many underestimate just how difficult that climb back can be. Exhaustion, dehydration, and heat stroke claim lives every year. And then there are the disappearances. The Grand Canyon holds more mysteries than postcards. According to park records, hundreds of people have gone missing here. Some fell from the rim and were never recovered, their remains hidden in inaccessible crevices. Others vanished on trails, their last footprints leading into the wilderness with no sign of return. Take the case of Glenn and Bessie Hyde in 1928, a young honeymooning couple who set out to raft the Colorado River through the canyon. Their boat was later found intact, supplies undisturbed, but the Hydes themselves were gone, swallowed by the river or by something else entirely. To this day, their disappearance is one of the canyon's enduring mysteries. Or consider more recent cases. Hikers who wandered off marked trails, never to be found again. Even experienced outdoorsmen, people who knew survival, have disappeared here without explanation. The canyon seems to hold them, hiding its secrets in the folds of stone. Locals sometimes whisper that the canyon has a will of its own, that it chooses who leaves and who doesn't. Of course, science explains it differently. treacherous terrain, unpredictable weather, the sheer scale of the place. But when you stand at the rim and feel how small you are against its vast silence, it's hard not to wonder. For the three friends, the canyon was supposed to be a test of endurance and a celebration of freedom. They saw the beauty, the challenge, the adventure waiting. What they might not have seen, or perhaps underestimated, was the danger. Because here, the line between wonder and peril is thin. And as history has shown, the canyon doesn't always return those who enter. So when Ethan, Mark, and Caleb disappeared, their story wasn't entirely unique. The canyon had claimed others before them. But what made their case different was what happened next. Because while most who vanish here are lost forever, their names carved into the long list of the canyon's missing, one of these three would return, alive, scarred, and carrying a story that would only deepen the canyon's mystery. The morning they began their descent, the sun was still low on the horizon. Shadows stretched long across the rim, and the air carried the coolness of night. Ethan, Mark, and Caleb adjusted their backpacks, double-checked their supplies, and stepped onto the trail with the kind of confidence only young men can summon. To them, this was just the beginning of something unforgettable. The first hours felt almost easy. The switchbacks led them deeper into the canyon, the walls rising higher on either side, the sky narrowing into a blue ribbon overhead. Ethan walked ahead, his camera clicking every few minutes, capturing the play of light against the stone, the way the colors shifted from gold to red as the sun climbed higher. Mark followed behind, steady and quiet, occasionally calling out reminders to pace themselves. Caleb lingered in the rear, sketchbook in hand, pausing to trace quick outlines of rock formations that fascinated him. Their banter echoed in the silence. Jokes about who carried the heaviest pack, stories about old high school adventures, plans for what they'd do after the trip. Ethan wanted to edit the footage into a short film. Caleb dreamed of publishing his drawings, and Mark simply wanted a cold drink and a warm bed when it was all over. By mid-afternoon, they found a flat stretch near a dry creek bed and decided to set up their first camp. The canyon air was hotter now, pressing against them, but the sense of accomplishment outweighed the fatigue. They pitched their tents, boiled water on a small camping stove, and ate dehydrated meals under the shade of a rock overhang. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the cliffs, Ethan set his camera on a tripod and recorded the three of them sitting around the stove, laughing. On the video, you can hear him say, "This is just day one. Remember this moment, because in a week, we'll be legends." It was meant as a joke. But looking back, those words carried an eerie weight. The next day followed a similar rhythm. Wake early, pack gear, push deeper into the canyon. They marked their progress on maps, careful not to stray too far from the planned route. Yet even in their caution, the canyon seemed to test them. The trails were rougher, the climbs steeper. At times, loose rock shifted under their boots, sending pebbles tumbling into unseen depths. Caleb's journal, later recovered among his belongings, described these moments in detail. One entry read, "It feels like the canyon watches us, not in a literal sense, but in the silence. Every sound we make, our footsteps, our voices, comes back sharper, like we're intruding on something ancient." That night, camped near the Colorado River, the atmosphere changed. The canyon floor was alive with the roar of rushing water, louder than they expected. Ethan filmed the current, remarking on how powerful it was, how it seemed like no human could stand against it. But on the tape, there's another detail. The camera captures Mark staring into the darkness on the opposite bank, his expression unreadable. When Ethan asks him what's wrong, Mark only shakes his head and says, "Thought I saw something." The footage cuts there. By the third day, small tensions had started to surface. Ethan wanted to push farther off the main trail to capture more dramatic footage. Caleb was hesitant, reminding him that the maps weren't always reliable and that unmarked paths could be dangerous. Mark, caught in the middle, tried to balance both sides, But even he admitted later in his notes that the canyon had begun to feel heavier. That night, the three set camp again, this time in a narrow gorge where the walls pressed close on either side. The fire they built flickered against the stone, throwing strange shadows. Caleb sketched by firelight. His lines hurried, almost frantic. One drawing showed three figures on the trail, but behind them, a fourth shape, tall and vague, blending into the canyon walls. No one knows if he meant it as a metaphor, or if he truly believed they weren't alone. What we do know is that these were the last normal days they spent together. Because after this point, the story stops being about laughter and photographs and plans for the future. From here, things begin to unravel. Quietly at first, like cracks forming in a stone. But soon, those cracks would spread, and the canyon would take from them what it had taken from so many before. And by the time anyone realized how serious it had become, it was already too late. The last clear record of Ethan, Mark, and Caleb comes from the fourth day of their trip. By then, their supplies were holding up, their spirits still intact, but something in the footage and notes they left behind suggests that cracks had started to form. Ethan's camera captured them breaking camp early, packing gear in silence rather than with the easy banter of the first days. On the recording, Mark can be heard asking, "Are we sure this is the right trail?" Ethan brushes him off, insisting he knows where they are going. Caleb, quieter than usual, writes in his journal, "Ethan wants to press farther. Mark says we should turn back. I don't know who to agree with." That was the first sign of division. Later that same morning, a pair of hikers claimed they saw three young men crossing a dry creek bed several miles off the main route. They remember one of them carrying a camera, another wearing a bright blue pack. The hikers later told rangers that the group looked tired but determined, moving quickly as if chasing daylight. When asked if the friends looked lost, the witnesses couldn't agree. One thought they seemed in control. The other swore they looked disoriented, stopping often to point at their map. That was the last independent sighting anyone could confirm. By late afternoon, the weather shifted. Clouds gathered over the canyon and a sudden storm rolled in. Rangers later reported heavy rain in the area, the kind that turns narrow gorges into rivers within minutes. Ethan's final video shows dark clouds swelling over the horizon, the sound of thunder rolling through the stone corridors. He laughs nervously into the camera, saying, "Guess we're about to get a free shower." Behind him, Mark doesn't laugh. His face is tight, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. After that, the footage ends abruptly. The search teams pieced together what they could from tracks and scraps of evidence. Ranger logs mention boot prints heading deeper into a side canyon, fading quickly on wet ground. They found fragments of a campfire, damp but still warm, suggesting the friends had tried to take shelter. But beyond that, the trail vanished. Some believe they were simply overwhelmed by the storm, caught in a flash flood, swept away before they had time to react. The canyon has claimed many lives this way, its narrow passages turning into traps when the rains fall. But not everyone agreed. When the families pressed for more answers, inconsistencies began to surface. Caleb's last journal page, smeared by water, barely legible, contains only a few frantic lines. "We're not alone. I can hear it again at night." The meaning is unclear. Rangers dismissed it as stress, exhaustion, or paranoia brought on by isolation, but others saw it differently, a clue that something else had been happening in those final hours. There were also rumors among search teams. One volunteer claimed to have heard voices echoing in the canyon at night, not just echoes, but full conversations carried on the wind. Another swore he saw fresh footprints days after the storm had passed, though no bodies were ever recovered. The official reports don't mention these details. Instead, they conclude that the three friends most likely perished in the flash flood, their remains carried to places too remote for recovery. Case closed, at least on paper. But the families never accepted that explanation. Ethan's parents pointed out that no trace of his expensive camera equipment was ever found, something too bulky to vanish entirely. Mark's sister asked why none of their supplies had surfaced downstream, if they had truly been swept away, and Caleb's sketches, recovered from his abandoned pack, only deepened the mystery. One drawing in particular showed a towering figure carved into the canyon wall, not a natural formation, but something almost human, watching. No one could explain it. The search dragged on for weeks. Helicopters scanned the cliffs. Rangers rappelled into dangerous ravines. Dogs were brought in. But the scent trails ended abruptly, as if the friends had simply stepped off the map. Eventually, the search was scaled back. The families returned home, broken but unwilling to let go. The names of Ethan, Mark, and Caleb were quietly added to the park's long list of missing. Another tragedy. Another mystery swallowed by the canyon. And for years, that was where the story ended. 3 young men, gone without a trace. But in the shadows of unanswered questions, rumors grew. Some said the friends had argued, that tempers had flared and violence followed. Others insisted they had stumbled onto something hidden, a cave system, a forgotten ruin, maybe even something deliberately concealed from the public. A few whispered of older legends, strange lights in the canyon, voices in the stone, figures seen at dusk that vanish when approached. The truth was buried beneath speculation, until 8 years later, when one of them walked back into the world, no longer the same person who had left, no longer laughing or carefree or even entirely recognizable. And with him, he carried a story that would turn everything the investigators thought they knew upside down. When the 3 young men failed to return on schedule, at first, no one panicked. Delays in the canyon are common. Trails take longer than expected, rivers run faster than maps suggest, and hikers often emerge a day late, dusty but unharmed. Families waited, reassuring themselves that Ethan, Mark, and Caleb were simply taking their time. But as the days passed, worry turned into dread. Phone calls to park authorities were made. Missing persons reports were filed. And soon, the search began. The Grand Canyon National Park mobilized quickly. Within hours, rangers were on the ground, retracing the friends' planned route. Helicopters swept over the cliffs, their blades beating against the silence. Dogs were brought in, noses pressed to the earth in search of any scent. Search and rescue teams rappelled into side canyons, probing dark crevices where the sun barely reached. At first, they found traces. Boot prints near the creek bed. A few pieces of trash, possibly from the group. A smudge of ash where a campfire had burned. But the evidence was inconsistent, scattered, almost teasing. Every lead ended in nothing. For the families, the waiting was unbearable. Ethan's mother flew in from out of state, standing on the rim with binoculars, searching the horizon as if she might spot her son from above. Mark's father set up a folding chair near the ranger station, refusing to leave until he had answers. Caleb's older brother joined the volunteers, hiking miles under the brutal sun, desperate for any clue. News crews arrived soon after. Cameras caught the tears of family members, the tense expressions of rangers, the helicopters lifting into the sky again and again. The story spread quickly, carried by headlines. 3 young men vanish in Grand Canyon. But even as resources poured in, the canyon offered only silence. The frustration among authorities grew. Rangers were trained for these situations, but even they admitted the case felt different. Normally, something turns up, a water bottle, a torn piece of clothing, a body eventually washed into view. But here, nothing surfaced. Not one solid trace of Ethan, Mark, or Caleb. Privately, some rangers began to doubt the official theory. Yes, the storm had been severe. Flash floods had swept through several gorges that night. But the lack of debris, the absence of remains, was troubling. One ranger wrote in his report, "If the flood took them, it also took everything they carried. Packs, cameras, gear. That's unusual. We almost always recover something." The families clung to these uncertainties. They pressed authorities for more answers, demanding to know why the case felt so different. Why 3 young men could vanish so completely in a national park that sees millions of visitors every year. And when answers didn't come, speculation filled the void. Some suggested foul play, that the friends had been targeted by someone else in the canyon, a drifter, an outlaw, someone who knew the land better than they did. The idea seemed far-fetched, but it circulated quickly online. Message boards filled with theories about hidden crimes and unsolved murders in the park. Others leaned toward the supernatural. The canyon has long been surrounded by legends, some dating back centuries. Native stories speak of spirits that dwell in the stone, watching those who pass through. Modern hikers tell tales of strange lights, of voices echoing at night that don't belong to their group. Caleb's final journal entry, "We are not alone," fueled this fire. Was it paranoia? Or had he glimpsed something others could not explain? And then there were the whispers of cover-ups. A few claimed the government knew more than it was saying, that caves in the canyon hold secrets, ancient dwellings, or perhaps something else entirely. Theories spiraled. Had the friends stumbled onto restricted land or uncovered something authorities wanted hidden? The lack of evidence made the story malleable, open to interpretation, and the internet was quick to supply its own conclusions. Meanwhile, the search dragged on. For weeks, teams scoured the canyon. Helicopters flew so often that locals began to recognize the sound as part of daily life. Volunteers from neighboring states poured in, some driven by compassion, others by curiosity, still others by the thrill of joining a growing mystery. But still, no answers. Eventually, resources began to dwindle. The park could not sustain such a massive operation forever. Officials met with the families, explaining that the likelihood of survival after so long was slim. The canyon, they said, had taken its toll. Scaling back the search was like a second death. Ethan's mother collapsed in tears outside the ranger station. Mark's father shouted at reporters, insisting his son was still alive. Caleb's brother refused to leave, hiking alone long after the official teams had gone home. By the end of the month, the search was formally suspended. The canyon had won, but the mystery refused to fade. Online forums dissected every scrap of evidence. Amateur sleuths mapped the friends' route, searching satellite images for clues. Documentaries speculated on the case, each one adding more questions than answers. For the families, life became a cycle of grief and obsession. Birthdays passed without celebration. Holidays arrived with empty chairs at the table. Every phone call, every knock at the door, carried the faint hope that somehow one of them had made it back. But for 8 long years, that hope remained unfulfilled. Until the impossible happened. One of the 3 stepped out of the shadows, alive, changed, and ready to tell a story that would shake everything the canyon had hidden for nearly a decade. For most missing persons cases, time dulls the edges. At first, there are headlines, camera crews, volunteers combing the ground. But as weeks pass, attention fades. The world moves on. Families are left alone with the silence. With Ethan, Mark, and Caleb, that silence stretched into years. Their families lived in limbo, caught between grief and hope. Ethan's parents kept his room untouched, the posters still on the wall, the camera gear still on his desk. His mother admitted that some nights she sat there in the dark, waiting for the sound of footsteps on the stairs. Mark's father refused to file the paperwork declaring his son legally dead, telling friends, "As long as they haven't found him, I won't give up." Caleb's brother continued to hike the canyon every summer, leaving notes in crevices, convinced that somehow they might reach him. But as time dragged on, uncertainty became its own kind of torment. With no bodies, no remains, no answers, the families were forced to live in 2 worlds at once. One where their loved ones were gone, and one where they might still return. Meanwhile, the public fascination only grew. The Grand Canyon had long been the setting of mysteries, but this case felt different. 3 young men, vanishing completely, with only fragments of journals and a handful of videos left behind. People wanted explanations, And when official ones failed, imagination filled the gap. Online forums became archives of speculation. Users dissected Ethan's videos frame by frame, convinced they saw figures moving in the background, shadows that didn't belong. Caleb's journals were uploaded and translated into a dozen languages, each line analyzed for hidden meaning. The simple phrase, "We're not alone," became a lightning rod, spawning countless theories. One theory suggested the three had stumbled onto a hidden cave system. The canyon is riddled with them, some mapped, most not. A few amateur historians pointed to old reports from the early 1900s claiming that caves in the canyon held artifacts not of this world. The friends, they argued, might have discovered something they weren't meant to see. Others leaned toward cult activity. Rumors circulated about isolated groups living in the canyon, cut off from society, practicing rituals in places tourists never reached. Could the friends have crossed paths with such a group? Some even suggested they had been taken in, willingly or otherwise. More extreme theories went further. Government experiments, military cover-ups, a hidden community beneath the canyon floor. Each new documentary or blog post layered speculation upon speculation, turning the missing men into symbols of something larger. The families hated these theories. To them, Ethan, Mark, and Caleb weren't mysteries. They were sons, brothers, young men with futures stolen away. But no matter how much they begged the public to remember their humanity, the myths kept growing. By the 5th year, the case had taken on a life of its own. Podcasts revisited the story. YouTube channels pieced together timelines, some serious, others exploitative. The canyon itself became part of the narrative, a place that wasn't just dangerous but hungry. Each new disappearance in the park, no matter how unrelated, was linked back to the three missing friends. And yet, for all the speculation, there were still no answers. No gear found, no remains uncovered. The silence remained absolute. For the families, the hardest part wasn't the mystery. It was the waiting. Birthdays came and went. Ethan would have turned 30. Mark's younger sister graduated college. Caleb's brother got married. At each milestone, the absence was louder than words. Empty chairs at dinners. Empty spaces in photographs. Still, some refused to give up. Caleb's brother, in particular, became relentless. He filed petitions, begged the Park Service to reopen the search, and spent his own money hiring private investigators. None of it led anywhere. Each expedition ended the same way. Silence. And so, by the 7th year, most had begun to accept the inevitable. Perhaps the canyon had swallowed them whole. Perhaps their remains lay in places too remote, too dangerous to reach. The world, it seemed, would never know. But just as the story was beginning to fade, just as the headlines were giving way to other tragedies, the impossible happened. In the 8th year, one of the three walked back into civilization. He was alive. He was changed. And he carried a story that would breathe new life into the mystery and raise questions darker than anyone had ever imagined. 8 years. That's how long the canyon kept its silence. Long enough for headlines to fade, for searches to end, for families to live inside the unbearable tension of not knowing. 8 years of empty birthdays, unanswered prayers, and questions that only grew heavier with time. And then, one morning, the silence broke. It began quietly, with a phone call to local authorities in a small desert town on the edge of Arizona. A man had stumbled into a gas station just after dawn, thin, filthy, sunburned, and trembling. His clothes hung loose on his frame, torn and faded by years of wear. His beard was thick, unkempt, streaked with gray that didn't belong to someone his age. His eyes, hollow, unfocused, as if they were staring at something no one else could see. When the clerk asked him if he needed help, the man could barely speak. His voice cracked as though unused for years. 2 words finally slipped out. "My name is Caleb." For a moment, the clerk thought it was some kind of mistake. But as deputies arrived, details fell into place. Fingerprints were taken. Old photographs compared, and the impossible became undeniable. It was him. Caleb, one of the three who had vanished without a trace, had returned. Authorities were stunned. The case had long been classified as closed, the official assumption being that all three friends had perished in the canyon flood. To see one alive shattered every conclusion. He was immediately taken to a hospital. Doctors described him as malnourished, severely dehydrated, and suffering from exhaustion. His body bore scars, deep scratches, burns, and marks that medical staff struggled to categorize. Some looked accidental, the kind you'd expect from years in the wilderness. Others didn't. One nurse later said quietly, "It was like he'd been hurt by things we couldn't explain." Mentally, he seemed broken. Caleb spoke little, often staring at walls for hours. When asked basic questions, where he'd been, what had happened to the others, his answers were fragmented. At times, he whispered about caves, shadows, and voices. Other times, he fell silent altogether. The news spread like wildfire. Lost Grand Canyon hiker found alive after 8 years. Television anchors called it a miracle. Online forums exploded with theories. And for the families of Ethan and Mark, it reopened every wound. Ethan's mother rushed to the hospital, desperate for answers. She brought photos of her son, pressing them into Caleb's hands, begging, "Where is he? Please tell me." Caleb looked at the pictures, tears filling his eyes, but said nothing. Mark's father was more direct, demanding explanations from police, from rangers, from anyone who would listen. If Caleb came back, he told reporters, "then my son can too. I don't care what they say. We'll find him." The authorities struggled to manage the chaos. Reporters gathered outside the hospital. Cameras followed every vehicle entering or leaving. Social media platforms lit up with hashtags. #Grand Canyon Mystery. #Caleb Returns. #What Happened in the Canyon. Some celebrated his survival as proof of human resilience. Others viewed it as evidence of something darker. The FBI stepped in, citing jurisdiction over missing persons cases on federal land. Their agents questioned Caleb for hours, but progress was slow. His story came out in fragments, tangled between moments of clarity and sudden breakdowns. He spoke of endless darkness, of stone corridors that stretched for miles, of whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. He said he had been kept alive, but not by choice. Doctors labeled it trauma. Psychologists spoke of post-traumatic stress, hallucinations born of starvation and isolation. But those who listened closely weren't convinced. His words carried a conviction that was hard to dismiss. The public, meanwhile, demanded more. Every news outlet wanted the exclusive interview. Documentarians offered contracts. Online communities dissected every gesture, every phrase, searching for hidden meaning. One grainy photo of Caleb leaving the hospital under heavy guard went viral, his sunken eyes and haunted expression becoming the face of the mystery. And through it all, the canyon loomed in the background, silent as ever. Why had Caleb survived when the others hadn't? Where had he been for 8 years? And why did he look less like a man rescued, and more like a man who had finally escaped? For the families, his return was both a miracle and a curse. A miracle because it proved survival was possible. A curse because it reopened wounds they had struggled to close. Ethan's parents pleaded for details. Mark's father demanded to lead a new search. Caleb's own relatives barely recognized him, whispering to each other that the boy they once knew was gone, replaced by someone older, harder, hollowed out by something they couldn't name. The canyon had given one of its missing back, but it hadn't given back the same person who went in. And as investigators pressed him for answers, Caleb finally began to talk. Not all at once, not clearly, but in fragments that, when pieced together, painted a story more disturbing than anyone was prepared for. A story that suggested the canyon wasn't just vast and dangerous. It was hiding something. Something that had kept him alive and had taken the others. They didn't interview him in a bright room. They dimmed the lights, set a glass of water on the table, and turned on a small recorder. The agent asked simple questions first. Name, date of birth, the last thing he remembered before everything went dark. Caleb stared at the red light on the recorder as if it were a fire he needed to warm his hands by. When he began to talk, it wasn't one story. It was many small ones that fit together like rough stones in a wall. Stage 1. The flood and the fall. The storm came fast, he said. It was like the sky broke. They'd sheltered in a narrow gorge, too narrow, he admitted. The water rose in minutes. Mud, sticks, and cold that bit like teeth. Mark was shouting over the noise, Ethan trying to keep the camera dry, and Caleb was pushing the packs up onto a ledge when the wall behind him gave way. The torrent hit like a moving wall. He went under, slammed against rock, came up choking, grabbed at a root, and somehow climbed. He remembered screaming their names until his throat bled. No answer. Only the roar of water. He climbed higher, scrambling onto a slanted shelf of stone. The rain beat the canyon into a single, snarling sound. Then he saw it. A dark seam in the cliff, half hidden behind brush torn loose by the flood. A fissure, no wider than a doorway. I went in because I couldn't go anywhere else, he said. I told myself I'd wait out the storm. Just a few hours. He lit his headlamp. The beam struck walls the color of old ash, slick with moisture. The passage bent, narrowed, then opened into a chamber tall enough to stand. He sat, shivering, and listened to the storm howl, and then fade. When he crawled back to the mouth at dawn, the ledge where he'd sheltered was gone. The gorge was different, as if the canyon had moved in the night. Going out wasn't an option, he said. So I went in. Stage 2. Survival in stone. This is the part that could be written off as simple survival. He described rooms that weren't rooms at all, just widenings in the rock. A ceiling low enough to scrape his scalp. A floor pitted with small basins that collected dripping water. He rationed the granola bars he had left. He turned his shirt into strips of cloth to bind a twisted ankle. He marked his path with chalk, arrows pointing back to the fissure. He slept in short, panicked bursts and woke to the echoes of his own breathing. Time didn't work right, he said. No sun, no moon, only the sound of water and the lamp cutting a tunnel through the dark. He found signs he wasn't the first to pass through. Stones stacked in careful piles, not natural, stood on the ceiling at shoulder height. A line of shallow holes carved in sequence along a wall, like someone had kept count of something. Days, seasons, or maybe just breaths taken. He followed the whisper of moving air. It led him downward. He learned to drink the water that pooled in cold bowls of stone. He learned the taste of minerals on his tongue, the smell of air when a chamber narrowed to nothing. Once, he heard a rush like wind and stepped into a shaft that opened beneath his feet. He caught a lip of rock and hung there for a long time, arms giving out, before he hauled himself back up, sobbing. At first it was just me and the rock, he said. Then I knew I wasn't alone. Stage 3. The others. He didn't see anyone at first. He heard them. A whisper that wasn't echo. A cough. The soft slide of a foot on grit. He killed his light and waited, his heart a drum he couldn't quiet. A thread of light moved in the dark, not a beam like his, more like an ember carried in cupped hands. They took the food first, he said, a faint smile that wasn't a smile at all crossing his face. Then they took me. He described hands that were calloused and careful. A voice that said, "Be still," cloth wrapped over his eyes. He was led, 3 left turns, a steep descent, a belly crawl, and then into air that smelled faintly of smoke. He called them the down below. Not a name they used. His words, because they offered him none. Rules were simple. No names, no fires that threw light upward. No noise during the quiet hours when the stone carried sound like a spy. He tried to ask where they were from. They didn't answer. He tried to ask why they stayed. One of them said, "Because up above is not ours anymore." He spoke of caches, old tins without labels, tools worn smooth, blankets stitched from pieces of canvas. He saw marks on walls at shoulder height. A kind of calendar, he thought, tallies in groups of 7, crossed at intervals. He slept on a ledge with a blanket that smelled of dust and old smoke. He traded stories for food. When he asked to leave, a man with a half-ruined ear said, "You can try." He tried. Twice. The first time, they brought him back. The second time, they kept him near, watched. "Were there children?" the agent asked. A long pause. "I heard laughter once. Or I dreamed it." Stage 4. The unexplainable. When he finally spoke about Ethan and Mark, his story broke into fragments. He said he heard Ethan's voice in the dark. Once, twice. Close enough to make his chest ache. He shouted. The down below bound his hands and sat with him until he stopped. Another time, he said a woman from the group showed him a place they called the Dry Well, a vertical shaft where voices rose like smoke. He leaned over the edge and listened. "I heard Mark," he said, and his voice changed shape, smaller, younger. "He said my name." He said. He stopped there. When he tried again, no sound came out. Caleb described lights without flame. He described warmth in the stone when no heat source was near. He spoke of a chamber where the air trembled with a low hum that made his teeth ache. The agent asked if he was sure. Caleb nodded. "It wasn't music," he said. "It was like the canyon was remembering." Doctors would later call this trauma. Starvation. Sleep deprivation. The mind making patterns in noise. But there were other details that were harder to file away. Rope scars at both wrists, old but unmistakable. A fracture in his left forearm that had healed poorly, consistent with a fall. A vitamin D deficiency so profound a physician muttered, off record. Years without sunlight. When they asked him where the entrance was, coordinates, landmarks, anything, he shook his head. "It moves," he said. "Rock falls. Seasons. It never looks the same twice." Stage 5. The deal. There was a bargain, or something that felt like one. He could stay, live by their rules, become one of the quiet people who walked like shadows. Or he could leave, if he could find the path himself. He tried to map the routes in his head. The chamber with the cracked ceiling, the passage that smelled of salt, the crawl space that tore his shirt. He tested his memory of air currents, of the feel of the floor under his palms. How did he escape? He said a storm came again, years after the first, and the water pressed through the stone, opening seams, closing others. The down below moved deeper. In the confusion, he risked the upward way. He followed cold air and the faintest scent of dust baked by sun. He slept in a place he called the rib cage, limestone curved like bones. When his lamp died, he followed the sound of his own voice, bouncing off walls, counting echoes until they came back faster. Tighter space, narrower tunnel, closer to an exit. He crawled out into a world that felt wrong at first. The sky too big, the light too loud, the sun on his skin like a burn. He walked until his legs shook, until the horizon broke into a road, until the road gave him a sign and a gas station and a clerk who thought he was some kind of ghost. Doubt. Investigators went back to the area where he'd last been seen years ago. They searched for fissures. They found some, always do in the canyon, but none that matched his description. A rockfall here, a sealed passage there. Dogs took them to a lip of stone and stopped. Air moved from somewhere below, cold and whispering. No safe way down. The down below? No evidence. No discarded tins. No blankets. No soot where he said the ceiling had been blackened. Just stone. Stone and the sound of their own breath. Some details Caleb gave matched known features of desert caves. The taste of air when it brushes a salt deposit. The way condensation collects in shallow basins. The low-frequency hum wind can create in certain chambers. Other details didn't match anything in the manuals. The calendars carved into rock, the heat with no fire, the voices rising from a dry well. A polygraph was proposed and abandoned. Trauma, they said, would skew results. A neurologist suggested temporal lobe involvement. A psychologist said prolonged isolation can fracture time. A ranger who'd worked the case from the beginning listened to all of it and still said quietly in the parking lot, something kept him alive. Something kept him there. What about Ethan and Mark? On this point, Caleb never gave a clean answer. Some days, he said Mark died in the first flood, swept away before the fisher was ever found. Other days, he said he heard Mark's voice after days, months, maybe years, with words too broken to follow. As for Ethan, he sometimes said he believed Ethan had walked with the down below for a time, learning the rules, before disappearing deeper where even whispers don't travel. And on the worst nights, he said nothing at all, just pressed his palms against his ears as if to block out a sound only he could hear. The families clung to whichever version gave them breath. If Ethan learned the rules, he could still be alive. If Mark's voice carried up a shaft, maybe the shaft still exists. If the canyon remembered, maybe it will remember differently next time. Reporters begged for a definitive narrative. Caleb had none. What he offered was a map drawn in fog. The flood, the fissure, the down below, the hum in the stone. The escape that felt more like being coughed up than rescued. Is he telling the truth? If truth is only what can be photographed and catalogued, then maybe not. There is no footage. The camera he carried is gone. There are no coordinates, only sensations, a smell, a taste, a pressure in the ears when the passage tightens. But if truth can also be measured in the shape of scars and the way a man jumps at the sound of running water, then his story weighs more than rumor. In the end, the investigators wrote what investigators must. Inconclusive. The public wrote something else. Legend. Forums filled with new maps. New arrows pointing to nowhere. Hikers reported seeing thin figures at dusk, moving along ledges where no trail is marked. A few returned with photographs of dark seams in the rock that look, to the hungry eye, like doors. Caleb sleeps with the light on. He keeps a glass of water by his bed and stares at it as if listening for a hum only he understands. When asked if he will go back to help them search, to point at a wall and say, "Here," he says what he always says. It moves. And the canyon, older than memory, says nothing at all. The Grand Canyon has always been more than a landscape. It is a labyrinth of stone, a cathedral of silence, and for some, a tomb. Its walls are older than memory. Its shadows deeper than imagination. And for all our maps, for all our satellites and science, the truth is simple. We do not know everything that lies within it. Ethan, Mark, and Caleb entered the canyon as friends, young, full of life, with a plan for adventure. 2 of them never returned. One came back 8 years later, carrying a story that bends the line between fact and legend. Was Caleb a survivor, clinging to the fragile edge of life in caves no one else has charted? Was he the unwilling guest of some hidden community, people who chose to vanish from the world above? Or was it something stranger, something the canyon itself holds, something that doesn't fit into the categories we call possible and impossible? The evidence is incomplete. The testimony fractured. The canyon, as always, remains silent. But what we do know is this. One man walked into the stone and came out transformed. His scars are real. His fear is real. His silence, at times louder than his words, is real. Whether his story is truth, delusion, or something in between, it leaves us with a chilling reminder that there are still places in our world where mystery has the final word. The Grand Canyon draws millions each year. Hikers, tourists, dreamers. Most leave with photographs and memories. A few never leave at all. And for every disappearance, the canyon adds another page to its book of unanswered questions. Perhaps that is the true lesson of this story. That even in the age of GPS and satellites, there are still voids on the map, places that resist explanation, places that test not only our endurance, but our understanding of what it means to vanish. And so, we are left with questions that echo like footsteps in the dark. What happened in those missing years? Where are Ethan and Mark? And what does Caleb's survival really mean? Maybe the canyon will answer. One day. Or maybe it never will. Until then, we are left with the same silence the families have endured for years. The silence of stone, of secrets, of shadows that move just beyond the corner of the eye. This is the Grand Canyon's gift and its curse. But what do you think? Did Caleb survive by sheer human will, scraping life from stone and darkness? Did he stumble into a hidden society that lives beyond the world we know? Or did the canyon itself take him, reshape him, and send him back as a warning? The mystery is yours now. Tell me what you believe in the comments below.